Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in the book of First Kings. We ended yesterday in verse 10. And we do recall that Solomon had asked for insight, for understanding, for wisdom, for knowledge. And that is an acute understanding at his age of 20 to have the insight and understanding of matters, issues, to be able to see things and discern the good, the bad, the right and wrong, so that he could actually judge or rule over Israel, the great people of God. Now, that in itself made God very pleased. And so we read that it was pleasing in the sight of the Lord. And obviously, anything that is good or evil is always in the eyes of God. And that Solomon had asked this thing. And so in verse 11, it says that, and then God said to him, and then means after it was described that God was very pleased, very happy to see the good thing that came out. It says, um, because. Now, when you talk about because, um, you always find that this represents a motive. This represents a motive, uh, and this is to pay attention to. For this reason, you have asked this thing, this davar, right? This davar of having knowledge or insight, and you have not asked for yourself uh, a long life. Means how should you say, a long life, to live for many days. That's how the Hebrew expresses it, but it's correct that it's a long life. He didn't ask to live for a long time. He didn't ask riches for himself. In this case, riches would represent wealth. Now, understand that this is a period where Solomon loved God, as we have read yesterday. Now, he has not asked for the lives of your enemies. What does that mean? It means that he did not ask for all his enemies to die. He has just asked for himself discernment to understand justice. Now, we need to break this down. Um, discernment Discernment means able to distinguish, right? Able to distinguish right and wrong, good and evil. The second part here is about understanding. Now, this word understand comes from the word hear, that he can hear, that he has the ability to, well, I guess you could say, hear intelligently, to give due consideration. And the final word here is justice, is to provide decisions that are just. So just judgment. I think we could say that. Just judgment. Why was Solomon asking this? Because he realized that he was very young. And how can he look at complex situations? He's never seen them before. And so he looked at himself as the role of God's anointed to rule over the great people of God. And so he needs this skill, this insight that he could see, understand, discern, consider, and give the right judgment, thereby reflecting God's justice. Now, look at what God says. Look, I have done according to your words. What you have said, I have done it. And this idea here means that God has imparted to him. Now, it's not so much as suddenly he became very wise, but I would say that suddenly he had the ability to sort things out very clearly. He had the keen insight to see things clearly. He had the ability to perceive good and evil. He has the ability and the boldness to make decisions and to understand what is just in the sight of God. So he can see things a lot clearly. And so God says, I've given you this. I've given you a wise and discerning heart. Now, understand this. Wise and discerning is an A and a B. You will find that in verse 12, wise is hakam, and that would mean someone who is very skillful with his observation, very insightful, very shrewd. So he's very intelligent, and that's what wise here in Hebrew actually means. And the second word here is about discerning, about understanding. So these are all synonyms. That God says, I have given you this ability. It's not that suddenly he could quote Proverbs. It's not that suddenly he knows a lot of wise sayings. That's not what it is. It means that he now will be able to look at complex situations and is able to discern, perceive, understand, skillful to sort things out and to provide just judgment. But God did say this one thing, that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. So God is making his ability very unique, and is unique in history. And that's why we have the sayings, to be as wise as Solomon. And so we need to understand that wisdom from a biblical Hebrew viewpoint is not some knowledge that's zapped into his mind, but that he has an innate, keen insight into situations, into the environment, into the people's character and behavior, into issues that he could sort things out very, very clearly. Again, God is saying this. He says, besides what you have asked, I have also given you. Now, it doesn't mean that he's got all this gold and silver and crown jewels sitting around. No, he says, I have given you is in fact an expression that says that this, consider it done, that in the course of his life he will amass all these things. And so wisdom or understanding, as he grows, he is faster to grasp situations. He doesn't have to grow up to be a 50, 60-year-old man before he understands wisdom. That is what God means. What you have not asked, you did not ask me this, so I am going to give you riches and honor. Now, riches, we understand this would be wealth. Honor literally means abundance. Abundance. And this can be an A and a B as well. Reason being is wealth means a lot of things, a lot of monetary things, wealth, right? Honor is also a lot of things, but a lot of things in terms of honor, dignity, and reputation. So, in this sense, God is going to give him a lot of, so in this case, wealth and honor, dignity. This would also be reputation. And this would be a lot of, because this word actually means weight. Riches means a lot of wealth. So this is riches. And this word would mean glory or honor. So basically, you understand that God is going to give him a lot, very weighty things. One is material, and the other would be immaterial, right? In the sense that these are not material things, these are all respect and reputation. So that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. When he says all your days, means that while Solomon is king, there will be no other kings around that will be as great as Solomon. Now, one of the things that you would need to understand is that in the Jewish history, they classify the period of David and Solomon as the golden era, meaning that's the height of the nation of Israel. There's the height of the glory of the nation of Israel. And it starts from David and it goes all the way to the kingdom of Solomon. And so in these cases, this is what God has said. In your days, there will be no one else as good. And this would be the golden era. There will be also no other period of time where the kings of Israel will be in such reputation and honor and dignity from the nations of the world, except for David and now Solomon. The rest of the kings basically tells us that it's just going downhill from here on. Verse 14. Now there is a condition. Very often we see this word if. The word if is really conditional. What it means is this is a condition that if you walk in my ways, if you keep my statutes and commandments, as your father David walked, then something is going to happen, that I will prolong your days. I will prolong your days is a verb that means to cause, to make long. That would be what God is promising Solomon, that if, as a condition, this will happen. If not, then of course this would not happen. So the condition is, number one, to walk in my ways, in the ways of God. Now, the ways of God would be in his Torah. God's instructions, God's ways. How does God want the king of Israel, his anointed, to behave, to conduct himself? Keeping, guarding my statutes and commandments. That is also the Torah. So what is this? Walk and keeping is really an A and a B. And so what we are saying is God has only one condition. That condition is to tell Solomon straight in the face. There's no ambiguity about this. There is no concept in the Hebrew to say you must believe in me, because the Israelites had already seen God at Mount Sinai. What is left to do is to do it. I think that would be the instruction, and this is the condition. If you do them, if you keep them, if you walk in my ways, and these are all verbs, by the way. Verbs means is action, can be seen. And in this case, to be seen by God. And God says, when you do that, I will make your days long. That's it. I will cause to make your days long, which means that in modern day, you'll be long life. Now, although there is always these phrases or accolades that whenever you see the king, long live the king, long live the king, these are words of blessing. That's true. But whether the long live the king will materialize, in this case, in verse 14, is hinged on the condition that God gave to Solomon. And so if you want to live long, well, just do this. Just do it. Learn my ways in the Torah. Know my statutes and commandments and keep them, guard them, and pass it on to the next generation as your father did. So that at the end of the day, as David had given Solomon his last words, he has walked with God all the way to the end. Then he tells Solomon, you do the same. God says, I will give you long life. It's not about a blessing pronouncement, but this is a promise. And so we say that this is a promise because it is what God will give Solomon if he fulfills the condition. Now, whenever that is considered fulfilled, now, I don't think that this is the fact that God is going to wait 40 years to see him. God is watching him every day. As long as he keeps the word of God, as long as he walks in the Torah or the instruction and direction of God, God will give him another day to live. And as long as he does that, you will find that there will be many more days in the years ahead. In verse 15, now tells us the fact that he was asleep. Remember, he was having a dream, and I had mentioned that this was a mechanism that God would have spoken to his people, like Daniel. Now with Solomon, he would have spoken with the prophets. This is what we would call an indirect way of communication because they are not supposed to see God's face. And in this case, you find that God uses an indirect mechanism, yet God is dealing with Solomon or his prophets. And he appears in a dream, and Solomon remembers exactly what was said in the dream. So it's called a dream in the sense that he would be in a transformed state of mind, but he is not unconscious in that sense. He is still very conscious in that so-called conversation with God in that alternate state of mind. Now, how does the mind work in this way? I really can't explain, but we do have an alternative mind going into a dream state. And God uses that means of communication or that channel when Solomon and the prophets in this communication, he is very, very conscious of what is being said. Finally, and then Solomon wakes up. Now, the idea of waking up means awake, to awake from sleep. And then, and so he says, oh, look, it was a dream. And then he came to Jerusalem, and then he stood before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. This is in the city of David. Remember, David brought the Ark of the Covenant back and kept it under a tent. And that would be the Ark of the Covenant, seen as the presence of God symbolically, and he offered burnt offerings and made peace offerings and held a feast for all his servants. So this was an in-house for himself and the men around him. He offered burnt offerings and made peace offerings. This is thanksgiving. Basically, this would be thanksgiving. It is not an atonement, it's thanksgiving. And can he do that? Well, at this point in time, there is no temple. He was uh, before this, before coming back to Jerusalem, he would have been in Gibeon, and he offered 1,000 sacrifices there. Now he offered thanksgiving as well, before God, in front of God. But there is no altar because the altar is in Gibeon. And in those days, people still offer things to God anywhere and everywhere on the Bama. And so in the city of David, it's like a Bama, it's a high place. Now, with this comes the end of the description of what the dream was to Solomon in the giving of the acute insight, the ability to see things and understand things at a very young age. And as he grows up, he learns even more and he exceeds the wisdom of everyone in the land as in time to come. Now, in verse 16, it begins a story. And the word here, then, this word is merely, it doesn't follow in this particular instance. It merely means at that time. It is a narrative. And so we are talking about the time between the first and fourth year of reign. Now, I have shown you that in chapter 2, that Solomon was very wise in making his decisions. And that is because now we see why God had given him the ability to make good and just decisions. And verse 16 onwards gives us a narrative of something that happened in those days. So it is not a follow on as an and then because of this word, right? This story comes to us with two women, two, and we are told that they were prostitutes, or the other word would be harlot. Now understand that these are people who has, well, I would say lower level of society, in the sense that they are not the lords, not the nobles, not the rich people. These would be what we would call the commoners of the day. They are just plain Jane, and they had a profession of harlotry. And it came to seek justice. So this would be a narrative of a story to describe the that particular skill that God had given to Solomon. And so they came to the king. And then after they came to the king, and then they stood before his face. And so what we now have is that we have, let's say, the king is on his throne. Solomon is here. And now we have two women standing before him. This is what it means to be before the king. It would literally mean in his face. Now the narrative goes on and tells us in verse 17, and then as they have come into the king's presence and stood before him, the and then is with regards to the story. It has nothing to do with what happened from verse 15 and before. And then the one woman said, so the narrative doesn't tell us the differentiation between the two women. It just merely tells us one of the women. One of the women says, "Pardon me, my lord." And this word "pardon me" literally is a humble phrase, right? It's a humble phrase. This could mean "excuse me." This is an introduction of catching an attention of the king. So it says, "Excuse me, king." It says, "My lord." It says, "This woman and I live in the same house. I gave birth to a child while she was in the house." No difficulty to the text. Verse 18, it says, and then, right? And then it happened on the third day after I gave birth that this woman also gave birth to a child. So now we have the first woman talking about the second woman also giving birth to a child. We were together. Now we were together. Uh, I guess you would say that they are together in the same place, right? In the same place. So now we have woman number one give birth, and then woman number two, after 3 days, give birth. So now we have two women having given birth and two babies. The condition or the environment that is being described is that there were no stranger in the house. It's only the two of us. The idea of stranger means that these are people who are not part of the house, right? Not staying there. Now, this other word, stranger, also has a meaning. There's no strange woman. Strange woman would also mean a harlot. And so basically, she's just saying that there is no other people with us. There's no other women in the house. There's no other people there or happen to walk in. Just nobody. Verse 19. Then, this would be, and then this woman's son died in the night because she laid on him. Now, the word she laid on him means that she had slept on top of the child. And so the child was smothered and the child died. That very night, very small baby. This word is so. It's like another and then. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while I was asleep. And she laid him at her breast and then laid her dead son at my breast. And so now we have a case of swapping. Now understand, this is still a narrative as a case brought before the king so that he can pass judgment on this. Verse 21. Verse 21 is, and I arise, and then again, I woke up in the morning to nurse my son, and I found that he was dead. But when I examined him closely in the morning, oh, look, he was not my son that I have given birth to. And so this woman says, I recognize my son. He is at least 3 days older than the other son. In verse 22 says, then, which is, and then. The other woman said, no, for the living one is my son, the one who is living, right? Who is living. And the dead one is your son. But the first woman said, which is this woman said, no, for the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son. And so they spoke before the king. And so now this one is a she said, and of course, she said. You have heard this phrase before. He said, she said. It's all a matter of conjecture, a lot of assertions. And so when you have two women standing in front of the king, going back and forth, look at what the king did. Verse 23, the word is, and then. This is what the story is to highlight uh, about the keen insight of the king. The king said, this one says, this is my son who is living, and your son is the dead one. The other says, no, for your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one. This basically is the case. The case is not about who killed the son or why did the son die. The case is whose son is alive. So understand that this is an ancient way. I guess when you watch some of the ancient judge movies in the Chinese era, like Bao Qingtian, you find that the commoners would come to seek justice, and this is what is happening to the two women. The woman who woke up and the son was dead is trying to seek justice that the other woman is having her son. And so now look at what Solomon said. Again, this word is, and then. After giving the case, the king then said, get me a sword. And so they brought a sword before the king. They would be the servants of the king. Verse 25. 25 is another and then. Notice this is a sequence of events. And then the king said, and in this case, this word is to say, cut the living child into two. This word cut literally means to divide. Divide the child into two, or cut into two. And this would be divide into two. That is the purpose of this word cut. And so after you have cut into two, you would give half to one and half to the other. And so each would have half of the child who was alive and now he will die. And that at the end of the day, both really get nothing, right? Both really get nothing. Now, did you think that Solomon was going to kill an innocent child? And obviously not. So this story is actually to display the wisdom of Solomon. And so we come to verse 26. Verse 26 tells us this. But, and this is, and then, the woman whose child was the living one basically is telling us this woman, we are not told which of the two. She is still an anonymous person here. But it is told to us that this woman who has the child that was living spoke to the king. And she said she uh, she was deeply stirred. Now, this word deeply stirred means uh, her compassion was aroused. This is about compassion, and it has been agitated. She's now very emotional about it. Uh, this word comes from the word racham, meaning compassion. It literally is derived from the word womb. Now, it is used in this case because it is to depict how the mother of the child that is still alive, uh, that she had been carrying for 40 weeks, is not about to let the son die. And so this word is racham, comes from the word racham, and it means compassion. And it was stimulated, it was burning with compassion. And she has that mother-child bonding, that she had given the child unconditional love. And so she has this emotion over her son, and she said, now this is the same word, excuse me, right? Excuse me, my Lord. Give her the living child. Do not kill him, right? Do not kill the child. Now, this word it means do not kill the child, do not cause him to die, do not let him die. No, that kind of understanding, because of the compassion of the woman. Now, the other woman, or the other, was saying, well, let it be, he shall neither be mine nor yours. Cut him. And so this word cut, remember, it's divide him. Let's each have half. We come to the last two verses of this chapter. Then, and this would be, and then, the king answered. He says, give to her, right? Give to her. This first woman is implied. It says, give to her the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother. So this first is inferred, right? And it's supplied by the translator. It's not in the original Hebrew. She is his mother, is the just judgment. It is not about killing the child. It is about preserving the child and letting the child have the life with the correct mother. And this story depicts the wisdom, the understanding, the keen insight that Solomon had. And verse 28 now tells us, with this story that has gone round the country, he says, when, and that would be, and then, All Israel. All Israel means all the 12 tribes, means from north to south. When they heard about the judgment which the king uh, had judged. Now, this is the word. The king had judged. The judgment that the king had judged. The word handed down is a modern English word because I guess in English style, you don't want to use the same word judge twice in the sentence. But in Hebrew, it's perfectly fine. And in fact, it gives clarity. They, who is they? All Israel. They feared the king. They feared the king. And in this case, when he says they fear the king, it literally means, let me just put it here. They 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 feared from the face of the king. Nobody would dare uh, tell the king any lies. Nobody would dare bring any false cases. That is what it means. They feared. They are terrified. They are afraid of the king because he can sort things out so clearly, because he is a just judge with keen insight, because they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. Now, what does these words actually mean? It says here that the wisdom of God literally means the insight, the understanding. And this would mean the understanding of Elohim, the understanding of the mighty one, was in Solomon to administer justice, to do justice, to give just judgment. And what does this reflect? It reflects God. And so the mighty one is also Solomon. Solomon is also known as the mighty one. He has the wisdom of Elohim, and it made him Elohim as well. He is wise and he can decide who lives and who dies. And so the insight that God has given him, the ability, the keenness, is not something that the people saw that he had learned all these days. It is something that God had given him. So the wisdom that belonged to God, this kind of keen insight, the understanding of complex cases, is always attributed to God, who understands all things. And it is now given to Solomon, who now can seek to sort out things with clarity. And so he is using this to administer justice, or to do justice, to give just judgment, because he now reflects God to the people. Hereby, as we come to a close in chapter 3, you would see that this is the first few years as this story was depicted in those days, how God has given him the keen insight for the people of God, that they would love him and fear him, so that nobody would dare cheat Solomon, or try to do a fast one and try to get away with injustice, because Solomon was able to deliver justice for the people, because Solomon is of God. They see that as a supernatural, a divine gifting that it's it can be seen. It is not because Solomon said, I have to give, but it is everyone in the nation, all 12 tribes could see it. They could understand it, and they could see that God is with Solomon. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.